Coming up, the biggest climate summit of the year welcomes the planet's environment heavyweights.
We must look for ways and ensure the inclusion of the role of fossil fuels.
We do not understand why everyone does not share our sense of urgency.
Delegates look at the most pressing issues facing humanity.
People are suffering not because they have any role in causing the crisis, but they are losing their homes, farms and income.
What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now!
But our governments are still funding the climate destruction.
And the first ever global stock take to help determine the path ahead.
This fund needs to be $100 billion a year fund.
We really need to factor in the human cost.
Climate! Climate! I said climate! You said justice! When I said people, you said power!
It is a just 2 degrees like you've never seen. Now, welcome to Dubai, where reportedly more than 80,000 people, world leaders, some of the world's most brilliant climate scientists, some of the most impassioned environmentalists have all been brought together for one cause: to stop global warming. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of this summit, here's a brief history on where we are. Dubai was once little more than a fishing village in the early 18th century, known for its pearl exports and trading port. In 1971, the UAE gained independence after 80 years of British control and relied heavily on its oil and gas deposits to power its economy. In just a few decades, Dubai transformed from a small trading hub to a major metropolis with a population of around 3.5 million people. Dubai's location in the eastern Arabian Peninsula, connecting Asia, Europe and Africa, has helped Port Jebel Ali and Dubai International Airport grow into major thoroughfares for passengers and cargo. The city is now widely seen as the gateway to the Persian Gulf. It's also diversified its economy away from oil and relies on revenues from trade, aviation, real estate, financial services and tourism. Dubai attracts millions of visitors every year, drawn to luxury hotels and resorts, world-class shopping and entertainment, and major events like the Dubai World Cup, shopping festival and air show. This shopping capital of the Middle East has a plethora of malls, souks and high-end boutiques. The Dubai Mall has over 1,200 retail stores. Real estate is a major magnet for international investors, with iconic landmarks like the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest skyscraper, and Palm Jumeirah, a tree-shaped man-made island popular for its beach clubs, nightlife and high-end homes. The sail-shaped Burj Al Arab is one of the most expensive hotels in the world, and the Dubai Miracle Garden features more than 50 million flowers, making it the world's largest natural flower garden. The city has also positioned itself to be a leader in innovation and technology, with initiatives like the Dubai Future Accelerators program to help start-up tech companies and the Dubai Silicon Oasis, a technology park. It's also investing in the development of blockchain technologies, artificial intelligence, and 3D printing. Dubai is also setting itself up to be a new headquarters for finance in Asia. Free trade, a low tax rate, zero income tax, and even its time zone has made the city popular for investors and money managers. Today, it's one of the most prosperous and wealthy cities in the world, but no city is immune to the effects of climate change. This is Dubai's skyline. It's pretty smoggy, right? Well, it's that way for a number of reasons. Extreme heat, high humidity, sandstorms even, that trap pollutants in the atmosphere. Air quality readings in the UAE are up to 5 times above the WHO's recommended standards, with air pollution-related illness causing nearly 2,000 deaths every year. Scientists say the high air pollution level is the result of the country's fossil fuel output. It's among the top 10 oil producers in the world. It also has the world's 7th largest proven offshore natural gas reserves near Abu Dhabi, putting out an average 4 million barrels of petroleum and natural gas per day, and the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company plans to boost that even higher.
كذلك برنامج لإنتاج لزيادة الطاقة الإنتاجية للدولة بواقع 5 مليون برميل بحلول العام 2027. شرحنا في البانل أن دولة الإمارات يجب أن تقوم بهذا الاستثمار، لأن لا نرى استثمارات مكافئة من العديد من دول العالم. والنفط صحيح أنه موجود تحت الأرض ولكن لا يستثمر لإخراجه، ونحن نحتاج إلى بين 12 إلى 14 تريليون دولار بحلول العام 2045. العالم يحتاج 12 إلى 14 تريليون دولار في مجال الأبستريم الاستكشاف والإنتاج والميد ستريم والداون ستريم.
These plans have put the UAE under fire at COP28 for hosting a climate summit while expanding its fossil fuel output. But the head of the oil company and president of COP28, Sultan Al Jaber, says all industry participation is good for everyone.
We must look for ways and ensure the inclusion of the role of fossil fuels. I ask you all to work together. Be flexible. Find common ground. Come forward with solutions and achieve consensus. And never lose sight of our North Star of 1.5.
And this year, inclusion means the registration of a record 2,400 fossil fuel lobbyists at the UN event, almost 4 times as many as last year's talks in Egypt. Critics say their presence undermines the integrity of the process.
There are more fossil fuel lobbyists here than all of the delegates from the 10 countries most vulnerable to climate change combined. There are more fossil fuel lobbyists here 7 times over than official indigenous representatives. They're here unchecked, roaming free, and we're here to say it's time for big polluters to no longer be allowed to write the rules of climate action.
But the controversy is hard to ignore. In November, Al Jaber saw a backlash from climate activists during an online event in which he denied the science linking fossil fuel emissions and climate change. He says his words were taken out of context. And documents leaked in early December prompted accusations of UAE plans to ink new oil deals at the summit. Accusations Al Jaber fiercely rejected, arguing they only sought to undermine progress at COP28.
I have said over and over that the phase down and the phase out of fossil fuel is inevitable. In fact, it is essential.
Al Jaber also responded to International Energy Agency warnings that the world will not meet net zero targets in time without a drastic drawdown in oil and gas production. He said fossil fuel companies were on track to achieve those goals.
So far, 50 international and national oil companies representing over 40% of global oil production have signed up. That is a phenomenal achievement. 19 of them are adopting net zero 2050 targets for the first time. And 31 have also committed to net zero methane emissions by 2030 for the first time.
But the UAE has announced plans to extract 40 billion barrels of oil and gas over the next 70 years, which could well exceed the carbon budget designed to keep the world average temperatures below or at 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. That could put the petrostate at odds with the 2015 Paris Accord, which it was the first Middle Eastern nation to sign, specifically with the Common but Differentiated Responsibility Clause that says the UAE should end oil and gas sooner than other less wealthy nations. Last year at the COP27 Climate Summit in Egypt, a new global pact was launched called the Loss and Damage Fund, which is meant to help developing nations cope with the cascading effects of the climate crisis. In particular, small island nations who contribute little to greenhouse gas emissions but are least equipped to deal with climate-related destruction. The fund was operationalized on day 1 of this year's Climate Summit in Dubai, but as our Mikhail Malik explains, many details remain unresolved.
The Loss and Damage Fund is meant to hold accountable the biggest fossil fuel polluters responsible for the suffering already caused by the climate crisis. Ever-increasing extreme weather events such as drought, floods, and rising seas have cost lives, infrastructure, homes, and territory, but also a loss of culture, identity, biodiversity, and sovereignty. Small island nations in particular might in the future face physical disappearance.
Every month's high tide, we are seeing 40% of the land covered with seawater intrusion. So sea level rise, Mr. President, is no longer something that we are expecting to happen in the future. As we speak now, it is happening in my country.
This means new homes on other islands or elsewhere will have to be found for the affected people. A permanent resettlement, if not planned properly, could lead to the loss of cultural identity. Island nations have long advocated for the establishment of a fund which focuses both on the financial implications and non-economic losses of the climate emergency. The fund, now operationalized, aims to ensure vital infrastructure can be rebuilt or replaced with more sustainable ones. But key details remain unresolved.
This fund needs to be $100 billion a year fund. If we won't get there overnight, that's a lot of money. That's more than half of all of the aid budgets in the entire world.
And there's a lot of questions as well on who will be eligible to the fund and how do we sustain finance to keep flowing to it.
The World Bank will host the fund for the next 4 years, with a developing countries representative having a seat on its board. For small island nations, they say they're suffocating under the weight of a crisis they did not create, collectively contributing less than a percentage to global greenhouse gas emissions. Nations like the Bahamas feel there's a growing sentiment that the world's biggest polluters are washing their hands off the job.
And so, we're left wondering how we should interpret the pledges of this COP. So little pledged, given what is needed. So late in the day, given what is forecast. Is the effort here more to reduce the noise pollution generated by our advocacy, rather than to address the carbon reduction and climate financing so urgently needed? Are we expected to remain quietly grateful? Frankly, we do not understand why everyone does not share our sense of urgency.
Climate finance for loss and damage is considered separately and in addition to securing funds for mitigation and adaptation to help the most at risk prepare for what's coming. But for 55 of the most at-risk countries, climate-linked losses over the last 2 decades amounted to $525 billion. Experts say the number could reach a whopping $580 billion annually by 2030.
My fear is that given that we know, according to them, that you need about $300 billion a year to cover loss and damage, unless we have an urgent set of decision making, we're going to suffer what every parent suffers from, exciting expectations and being unable to deliver them.
Mikhail Malik, Just 2 Degrees.
It was your Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, last year at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh who stepped up to the plate and really brought to light the challenges faced by small islands and the underdeveloped world. Why do you think she had such sway at the time?
I think her speech encompassed the perspectives of small island developing states and less developed countries, and all those countries who face the challenges of not being able to access financing when they most need it. There is a challenge in mobilizing finance for climate and mobilizing finance for disasters, where the process is normally long, it's burdensome, it's cumbersome, and when you most need it, you are faced with the challenge of capacity and an inability to access the funding that you most need to help human beings recover from tragedy and disaster. I think that really resonated with the rest of the world and really pointed to an injustice that has plagued us as the global community that really needs to be rectified. And in addition to that, her speech put forward solutions that were easy to understand and really address the crux of what needs to be done to move us forward.
Are you annoyed by the pace of the developed world?
I think the cry and the comment generally has been throughout this COP is that time is not on our side. We cannot continue to engage in long protracted negotiations to agree to things that we know have already been outlined as things we need to do. The pace needs to improve. There needs to be greater momentum. We need to do things faster. Just thinking about the results of the global stocktake and where we are in terms of mitigation. Are we going to overshoot the target? Will we reach the target that's set by 2030? What are the implications of that? We need to factor that in to our thought processes in the developed countries who have committed to supporting countries through this process and through the mechanisms that have been outlined through the Paris Agreement. really need to factor in the human cost of inaction, what it means on a year-to-day basis for us in the Caribbean when we're faced now with, throughout the hurricane season, we're now faced with devastating heat. I mean, the last 3 years have been horrendous in terms of heat. We're seeing the impacts increasing on a year-to-year basis. The pace at which we act needs to factor those things in. We do not need to wait for devastation, more loss of life, more devastating impacts, things that we may not have initially envisioned as impacts to happen.
Why is the loss and damage fund such a divisive issue?
The reality is that rich countries don't want to accept their responsibility for causing the climate crisis. The fact is, majority of the emissions that we have in the atmosphere right now locked in have come from rich countries who are primarily responsible for the crisis, and they are not accepting it and they are not ready to pay. And that's why it has been a long fight, 30-year long fight to even arrive at a point where we are now going to be establishing a fund. People are suffering not because they have any role in causing the crisis, but they are losing their homes, farms and income, and they have not been getting any support from the current system.
It sounds as though you're saying that wealthier countries just have not accepted their responsibility for the emissions they've let out into the atmosphere.
Well, absolutely not. And that science is very clear. And when you have a role in the kind of losses and damages that we are seeing, then you are also responsible to help people recover from these impacts. But they have not accepted this responsibility, and that's exactly the reason these conversations have been really very difficult.
So quite a bit of money has been pledged so far. Your thoughts on this more than $700 million that several countries have put together?
So, yes, it sounds like a lot, but it's actually not, because the need is now running into hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's the estimate coming from various studies, and it's only in developing countries annually to the range of $290 to $580 billion. So imagine $700 million is not even peanuts. And another thing that we are going to now find out once we know details of this money, whether it is a real money in terms of public finance, or is it loan, or even money going to insurance, we know that it's not going to help people who need to now rebuild their lives.
Thanks so much. 6 of the world's biggest dairy companies have promised to report their methane emissions by mid-2024. Danone, Bell Group, General Mills, Lactalis, Kraft Heinz and Nestle made the pledge as members of the new Dairy Methane Action Alliance launched at COP28 in Dubai. But reporting is only the first step in reducing the potent greenhouse gas. Let's take a look at how cows factor into the methane problem and what's being done to tackle it. Sarah Bolter has more.
Humans have delighted in dairy for thousands of years. Today, around 6 billion people regularly drink milk and eat other dairy products. But wherever there's dairy, there are cows that contribute to climate change.
The rumen is the first stomach in the cow. You'll remember that cows have got 4 stomachs. They have this kind of pre-fermentation vessel. It's what allows them to use low-quality forages to convert grass and silage and straw into milk and meat, things that we can't eat into things that we can eat. Now, the rumen fermentation does lots of good things, but one of the bad things that it does is produces methane.
And by burping, farting, and breathing, one full-grown cow produces up to 500 liters of methane a day, according to the UN. Scaled up, livestock industries make up 30% of global methane emissions produced by human activity. Climate scientists consider methane a greenhouse gas nearly 30 times as potent as carbon dioxide, a major driver of global warming.
We have already achieved the 1.4 degrees warming, and that's so far the warmest year since 1850. We have also broken records in main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane and nitrous oxide.
As few anticipate a drop in demand for dairy, scientists and farmers all over the world are running experiments, looking for a way to cut a cow's methane emissions. Experiments like the MetaCow project, On a German farm near Munich, scientist Thomas Edel is testing new types of feed.
Also ich denke, dass diese Ergebnisse direkt den Landwirten helfen können bei der Einschätzung, wie hoch ist denn diese Methanausscheidung und was kann man denn dagegen tun. Es ist sicher so, dass die Molkereien verstärkt herkommen werden und vom Landwirt Minderungen fordern und dann kann man halt als Landwirt auch einschätzen, wie kann ich das erreichen.
Other technologies include biodigesters that trap methane emissions from cow manure. But more time and testing is needed to see just how effective these approaches are. Time we might not have.
We are living through climate collapse in real time, and the impact is devastating.
Sarah Balter, Just 2 Degrees.
A few of the planet's biggest dairy producers said they'd pledged to start disclosing their methane emissions. What do you think this means for the planet? Is it good at all?
Not really, to be honest. I think it's part of a delay tactic. So they said they would disclose their emissions by mid-2024, but they clearly said as well that no specific targets have to be set at the moment. And I mean, we're so late in this climate crisis already, and the dairy industry is hugely responsible for methane emissions. I mean, let's look at the overall picture. When we use ruminant animals to produce food, then we are simply replacing CO2 with a much more powerful greenhouse gas, which is CH4, methane. And the story we are hearing here from the dairy industry is that we can get the necessary cuts simply by better cattle management, is what they call it, like tech fixes, like methane masks or feed additives. But the science is very clear that we can only get the necessary cuts that we need by rapidly reducing the number of farmed animals, of farmed ruminants, and also freeing up the land that these animals are occupying. Because this is something that's very much overlooked, the importance of land use in this crisis. Land use is connected to so many environmental problems, and we simply have to free up land to store carbon.
So I'm currently standing in the blue zone where world leaders, fossil fuel industry experts, as well as climate experts are all gathered to discuss the most pertinent topics to the crisis. Now, there is very limited protest action here, but in some areas there are designated points where environmentalists can get their point across. So there are just 14 of you today asking for an end to fossil fuels. What kind of difference are you hoping to make?
Well, it is very clear that the fossil fuel interests are very present at this conference. It's also very important that younger generations, that the people who are affected by this crisis are like holding against it. So we are building up pressure, especially in the last days where the negotiations are happening.
So I see there are quite a few of you from different parts of the world. Is this a stronger alliance, you think, to get your point across?
Yes, we all are from Europe and we have all the same problem. We have a government that is still funding fossil fuels, even though we know the science is very clear that we need to stop with fossil fuels. But our governments are still funding the climate destruction. So we are gathering together to say, okay, we are not alone in this. We are collaborating together and getting stronger together.
And based on the last draft of the global stocktake, it would suggest that oil producing countries have no interest in phasing out fossil fuels. What do you want to say to them?
Well, we expect, especially from the continent we come from Europe, we especially expect them to negotiate for a full fossil fuel phase-out. We have a historic responsibility, so that people who say they are climate champions, they also need to prove it, that they are.
Now! What do we want? Climate justice! When do we want it? Now!
And I spoke with Friends of the Dugong, a campaign backed by the Leave It in the Ground initiative. They're particularly concerned of the future of the dugong, a species vulnerable to extinction that inhabits the waters in and around the UNESCO-recognized Marawa Marine Biosphere Reserve off the UAE coast.
We came here to give a voice to some animals that they don't have a voice. And right now there is a big gas development in their protected area, an area that was protected for them, the dugong.
These are manatees.
It's in the same family as the manatee. And the second largest population of dugongs are in the Arabian Gulf, and the densest of it just off the coast of Abu Dhabi. And there is a UNESCO protected area there. And there is a sour gas project, an ongoing sour gas project. They are developing it, and in 2 years they will start the extraction. And we want to ask for stop the extraction in the protected area.
And that's our show. We leave you with pictures of climate activists who say that hundreds of billions of dollars, not hundreds of millions, are needed to address loss and damage caused by the climate crisis. They're demanding that wealthy nations pay their fair share. They also want an end to global reliance on fossil fuels and an equitable transition to renewables. See you next time. Bye.